Welcome to the Cartoon Pad again with Bob Eckstein and my co-host Michael Shaw and our producer Marty.
Hello,
Today's going to be a great episode. We have a lot to cover. I'm sure we'll cut most of it. And Marty, our producer, actually threw up an idea.
Marty threw up? He said he wasn't feeling well.
He threw up this idea about animating the show.
I just threw up a little in my mouth.
I threw up an idea about animating the show.
Okay. That's good.
Yeah, there's some really fun stuff that you can do with technology these days. And I know that people keep on saying, we want to see something with this podcast, not just listen to it because you're talking about cartoons.
I know.
And I agree. But I mean, do people really want to see us? I don't think so. Like these Zooms, like no one really wants to see
Marty,
our faces.
I am a handsome man.
He is.
Yes,
but
everybody says so.
Bob is beautiful.
We're old school though. What about puppets?
Puppetoons.
Correct. So there is something that I've been playing with a program called Adobe Character Animator. It is a great piece of technology that kind of is a shortcut for a lot of today's animated shows. Tuning Out the News uses it. Our cartoon president uses it. So it's stuff that's like a real quick turnaround, and you can kind of quickly do basic animated mouths, basically, and some basic head movements and shoulders, and some small things.
Is it like Crash Cargo?
I don't know what that is, but I'll agree with you.
It's
keep going.
Isn't it the show where they just put mouths in where they drawing? I mean, instead of
it seems like maybe
head,
you can kind of have an animated head and the head kind of moves. But the point was, I was thinking, hey, what if we had the Cartoon Pad people? So like you both drew maybe together, you joint drew something that looked like a you cartoon, like a Bob Eckstein cartoon and a Michael Shaw cartoon, and maybe there's like a me that pops in every now and then, but it looks like a very cartoon, simple line on white paper kind of a deal. And then every episode you guys draw the guest, and then when we do a video version, it is an animated version, using this audio that we're using right now, but we take this audio and we shove it into this animation machine so that there's a cartoon Bob and a cartoon Shaw sitting in some kind of an environment that is the Cartoon Pad.
Oh God!
I have a mid-episode correction. It wasn't Crash Cargo. It was Clutch Cargo.
We knew that.
That makes much more sense now.
Yeah, yes, it does.
And you have me and Michael doing more things together.
Yes.
Why don't we have the listeners give us some feedback? We got listener feedback too. We should.
What is the listener feedback?
Listen to the listeners. We got two things. One I heard was keep the show as short as possible.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. And, we talked about this earlier, Michael, about how the listeners could speed up the show. There's actually a mechanism on your podcast site. You can make the speed of the podcast faster or slower.
Wow.
Yeah. So you can sound like Alvin and the Chipmunks doing the Cartoon Pad.
We could go slow. No, we could go very slow or very, very fast.
Yes, I talk very slow when I'm trying to think and talk. So I try not to think when I talk, and I'm fine.
So the faster you talk, the smarter you are?
Yes. What? Huh? Good night, everybody.
So that's the key. We have to keep speeding you up.
But just Mike.
So
yeah.
So do I need to go to the local truck stop and ask around for some, stuff?
We'll get
what are you talking about?
Sure.
Speeding things up, man.
Out here, the guys lined up.
We'll get them on some 1980s Nutrisystem diet pills.
Exactly.
Boom. Right there.
The guys here.
I'm going to go get a NOS. I'll be back.
They line up about 5:30 a.m. outside the diner by me, waiting for the diner to open.
Waiting for Bob to open.
Oh, geez. You always have to work so blue. We do have another letter.
Okay.
We got a letter, and this one is from a guy. I'm going to use his. Not going to use his real name. A guy named Joe. He's a gag cartoonist for many, many years. He wrote a letter, handwritten letter. Very nice of him.
Can you show it to us?
Did he cut out little parts of magazine letters and newspaper fonts to make a ransom note that he sent to you?
Oh, good God. Story, fellas. Come on. Let me just spit this out. It's
Are you doing this podcast today from his basement tied up?
Yeah.
I will go on strike.
I don't want to know what
he's to a water heater.
Yeah, I don't want to know what he's spitting out either. So
I gotta tell you, you mentioned something last episode about going on strike. I'm going on strike now. I didn't even know until recently we're not getting paid.
Who?
What?
Me and Michael don't get paid for this.
Oh, I'm finding a second income. I'm applying for the position of cartoon editor for the Weekly Humorist.
I'm glad we changed.
I think you have to pay me for that position. Actually,
no. You'll be getting my cover. You'll be getting my cover letter soon. I'm having it proofread.
I do need help with cartoon editors and submissions, so that would be very helpful.
Well, Bob's way into submission, chained to that radiator. So
yeah.
Can we do an interview on the air before our guest comes on? And then I'll get to my letter from a cartoonist.
From me?
Joe.
No, we can't do that. I have to send the cover letter and set up a time for an interview at Marty's convenience. And I hope to hear from him soon. Sincerely, Michael Shaw.
Are you sweating?
He's spritzing.
I'm dripping with sweat, but that's only because I like it at a cool 95 degrees in my apartment.
Okay, let's go back.
I have the flop sweats because I do anytime I interview.
Okay, we lost half our audience discussing them. Let's just go back to our letter.
Yes.
A guy named Joe has been submitting to the New Yorker for many years. He's never sold a cartoon in the New Yorker, and he fell into a depression about 5 years ago. And his extended family decided to have an intervention about this because he was so upset about this plight that he hasn't been able to sell a cartoon. And he says that our book, The Elements of Stress, has helped him get through this difficult time. It was the first big step to him getting back his motivation to get back into humor and back into cartooning. And he's totally sincerely honest. I mean, this really did happen.
Really?
It was really nice of him to write this letter.
Did he look at your book and say, God, if these guys can put out a book, anything is possible?
I was going to say that, but we were trying to be, Marty, you said we're trying to be positive.
Yeah, you kind of ruined a really
episode.
You ruined a really nice moment. You know what I mean? All right, never mind. Just forget it.
That's a very nice thing. It's a very nice thing for him to say, and that's exciting. And you're motivating people, and I think that's great.
We're gonna do an ad. We're gonna hear a word from our sponsor.
Jingle time.
Yeah,
Jingle.
The good people at Ink Spill, hosted by New Yorker cartoonist Michael Maslin. And that's the first key to professionalism, is to mispronounce your sponsor's name. That's always the top flight people.
I thought it was Joe.
No, we're moving on.
Oh, that's the other guy.
That story, we've moved on. We're going to give our sponsors some love right now. And this time we're going to do it without a script, because I think one thing we've learned is that we don't work well with a script.
I got a jingle. Maslin, Michael Maslin. He's a fabulous New Yorker cartoonist. He's from somewhere in New York. That's all I get. So we're on to Bob. Take it, Bob.
Yeah, it's this website is where you go if you want to know anything about what's going on in the New Yorker world. He is the New Yorker expert. That's inkspill.com.
Inkspill.
And we'll probably have him on at some time.
INKSPILL.
And now,
Inkspill.
thank you, Michael. Now back to the show.
Good ad break, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Yeah, we're trying to keep the show as short as could be.
I've been
learning about podcasting. Michael, I'm going to give you a quick quiz right now about podcasting. All right, you ready? Oh, you've been studying. Michael's holding up a book. Everyone has a podcast.
Everyone's got a podcast except you, but we're calling ours Everyone's in the New Yorker except you.
Right. That's a good one.
So, and our advice is forget it. We don't need the competition anyway.
Don't submit.
Don't submit.
No,
Stop wasting their time.
Those are sweet words.
You guys have just been recently both in the New Yorker.
Exactly.
Are you guys in the same issue?
No, I was in the fiction issue.
Okay.
And Bob was in the friction issue.
I actually didn't look at Eva 1. I haven't really looked at the magazine recently.
Bob's on strike. He mentioned that.
I'm on strike. So
Michael, if you ever want to see a New Yorker magazine for free, just wait and just walk around the Brooklyn Stoops where I am in Park Slope, and people will put out like a stack of 100 New Yorkers on their stoop, and people will just pick them up and take them home. And it's like a stoop library system for publication.
Oh, that's nice. I like that.
Yeah. Do they smell like your dentist?
Because they're too nice to throw away, so people just don't know what to do with them. So they don't want to recycle them. They put them out in their stoops. People just pick them up.
You can tear the covers off and wallpaper your bathroom.
You definitely could do that, or use them for something else in your bathroom.
Some people have done that. I've been given photographs of people's bathroom where they wallpapered the walls with.
Hey, how do the covers work in the New York? Have you guys ever submitted cover ideas? And is that a whole different monster?
Yeah, that's the art department. I'm sure Bob can expound on that.
Yeah, I've submitted many covers. I've been told I got close, but no cigar. And the way it works is that there's a different art director for that who chooses the covers, and you submit a batch. You submit a batch of ideas, and they're usually done up pretty close to what they're going to use.
I have a story, Bob. Excuse me.
Do you know how much a cover gets paid?
Oh yeah, it's like $500,000. It's incredible.
It is not $500,000.
Oh, it's Canadian. I'm sorry.
You're just creating money amounts now because that's more money than there is.
But I have to say, I was actually back in the day when New Yorker was at 4 Times Square. I was there. I was actually doing copywriting for Bob and the Cartoon Bank. And
Bob
I was
Mankoff.
just hanging. Yeah, Bob Mankoff. And I was just wandering around in the office, and they had all these recent covers up on the wall, plus I guess perspective covers. And he came up to me and he said, this is a direct quote. He says, "Don't even think about it." So I didn't. And I don't.
Don't make me have to reject you.
He doesn't reject it. It's I'm going to get this wrong. Francois Mouly.
You're right. You got it right.
He's the art. I guess he's the art director.
No, she is. She's the wife, and she's the wife of Art Spiegelman.
Yes.
Oh.
Who we should have on the show, and I have listed as a future guest.
Hey, what before we have your big guest that you're going to talk to, what are people drawing with? Anybody have any fun art supplies that they're using?
Oh, good God.
Actually, I do. I don't have it in front of me.
I've been using chunky Crayola markers on white sketchbook paper, and I've been using them to take notes. I have a big pad, and I'm literally writing notes to myself instead of small pieces of paper with like a tiny pencil. I use this big fat drawing tool, which is great, and I write big notes on big.
How Trumpian of you?
I think I'm just getting old, but I write things much bigger now, and then it's like I can't avoid them. I can't avoid my tasks if they're this big.
Marty, is it scented?
I mean, anything is scented.
No, got to take the cap off. Got to take the cap off and put it in your.
Yeah, I guess
in your nostril.
It's a little scented.
See, that's the thing with Sharpies. You can get high off of them.
Yeah, you can. Definitely.
Actually, there's a retractable Sharpie. Have you seen this?
I have. I feel like those dry out very quickly because the retractability of it, there is still a little opening.
Yes.
And that dries out. These bad boys, as long as you keep this thing capped, these will last.
Yeah, I'm still a Micron man.
Micron's good. Bob, what do you
use, Bob?
What are you packing, Bob?
I have to tell you, I find this conversation really just not of interest. I grab anything that's around the desk.
You wanted nuts and bolts. Bob is Mr. Nuts and Bolts. We've shared our nuts and bolts. Now you share your nuts and bolts.
Well, yeah, I just grab whatever around. I mean, it could be a pen or a marker, or even I have these like novelty pencils that are like old twigs that are also pencils. Or I work on the computer and I use a tablet. But to me, it's always been like, well, one moment I'm doing a cartoon in one material, and then I could be doing something else depending on where I am. Yesterday, I worked in front of a campfire in the woods. So I didn't use my tablet. And
that's so nice. Is that where you drew the Sharknado wedding cartoon?
No, actually, I drew that when it started raining and I had to come in. So it's just like a victim of circumstance of what I'm using and where I'm working.
Oh, by the way, that was the first cartoon I accepted as cartoon editor.
Yeah,
for
let's
the
go back
Weekly
to that.
Humorist.
I would love,
We
Mike,
had
if you
to
start
fix your.
rejecting everyone.
It was just a tornado, and I said put some sharks in it, and that's a winner.
And oddly enough, I know the producer of Sharknado, Paul Bales, and I'm going to send him a link to that, and he is going to definitely tweet it out. And the guys over at this place called The Asylum, they make Sharknado, they make all these kind of like sci-fi, cheesy action, kind of like
man.
fun type movies and TV shows.
I'm glad I know you now. That's
they'll
cool.
definitely appreciate the Sharknado mention. They'd love it. So that'll
that's
be
interesting because that's like product placement. And actually there was cartoons starting to do that about 2 or 3 years ago. The New Yorker cartoons, some of them started having a little bit of product placement. And then it took off to the sites, Cartoon Stock and the Cartoon Bank. I think the Cartoon Bank also made it possible that you could add your pet's name in the cartoon. If there was like a dog in the cartoon, if you wanted to get a print and have your dog in the cartoon, they would put the name in the caption.
So if you're Pink and her dog's name is Fucker, they would do that.
Right.
So you can just customize a cartoon so the caption has a replaceable name for the user who's buying a print of the cartoon.
Right.
Yes.
When
That's
I
great.
I started cartooning in 2007, I was doing that the first 2 years. I was putting my doctor in the cartoon to pay for some of my medical bills, like little things, whether it was, I'm not going to go into it and divulge my problems. Right. These are all like
medications.
These are all fake illnesses.
Erectile dysfunction.
Bob is just paying for things. He barters with cartoons. He's sitting there and drawing things for the cable guy.
For medical care.
Con Ed.
Yeah.
Think of the quality of that
supermarket
you got.
There was a long time ago, there was a story on 60 Minutes about this artist, and the artist would do paintings and he would do drawings that looked exactly like currency.
Yes.
And he didn't say that this is a $1 bill. That he didn't say this is a $50 bill. He said, this is a drawing that I did of a $50 bill. And people would accept it because it was art. And they knew it wasn't real currency. And they were like, this is amazing. And that's what he did. And I was amazed by that. He used those, speaking of micron pens, he would get really, in there.
So you could take them to the Banksy and deposit them.
Very funny. Yes, definitely good.
He was the darling of NPR.
The guy that drew the money?
Yeah.
I need to look up, we need to look up what his name is and stuff.
No, we don't.
The money.
Incidentally, today's magical guest has arrived. So are you ready to do his big introduction when he joins?
Let him join us. Say hello. And we'll say the intro while he's here.
Absolutely. Joining now.
Our next guest is known as a political cartoonist and founder of World War III Illustrated, as well as being an illustrator and writer for most every major publication, including the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Entertainment Weekly, and the New Yorker. And he has been credited as a cartoonist for all sorts of places, including Mad's Spy vs. Spy. And he's also appeared on the cover of Time Magazine, Newsweek, and The Progressive. And he's won many awards, including a Journalism Award from the Society of Newspaper Designers and a gold and silver medal from the Society of Illustrators. So
that's really old. You got a really old version of that, I can see.
Well, let's welcome to the show, Peter Kuper. Peter, that's a great resume.
Thank you. And Red Book. You forgot Red Book.
Yes. Did you win the Cy Young Award in 1974?
Exactly. That's yeah. Cy Old, maybe. But
yeah, we had to condense it. This is an abbreviated introduction because we could have went on for an hour.
Yeah. I'm also co-founder of World War III, not founder solely, but thanks for that.
So you started World War III. That's
Illustrated.
Okay, illustrated.
You got to clarify, Peter, because a lot of listeners are going to be confused.
If you type that in, if I go for a search, even when I'm like, I'm just going to look at some of the website, I'm always getting the apocalypse when I just want to get the magazine. So.
But when you founded that magazine, you actually founded it with, is this right? Someone you knew back in your hometown in Cleveland. Is that your
Seth,
friend?
Seth DeBachman and I lived one street apart starting in first grade. And we got into comics together when we were quite young, 7, say. And then at age 11, we started our first fanzine and published that for about 4 years and interviewed. It was like an opportunity to interview people. And this is when I barely drew at all. And I just was super interested in comics at a really lucky time to get into the field, which was to say like 1970. So there was a small group of people who were interested in comics, and you could go to a comic convention and meet in New York. I grew up in Cleveland, and I'd go to New York in the summer. Seth and I would go, and you could meet every major comic artist and then interview them for your little fanzine. So we interviewed Bill Gaines, who the publisher of Mad. We interviewed Jack Kirby, Neil Adams. I was like, we were superhero fans. We interviewed Robert Crumb through the mail. It was the infancy of the forum, which is still going on to some extent. But at the time, it was like such an open door that you could just walk up to anybody, and there was nobody who was, like so famous that they were, standoffish. And so you could say, hey, could I interview you for my, 100 copy fanzine? And they go, sure. And you take them to a corner with your little tape recorder, and we'd ask them, what brush they used or whatever.
So is Jack the King Kirby smoking a big stogie?
He wasn't, but he could have been. He had that look. He looked like he had it like ready at the side there.
When I finally saw him, I had a completely different picture of what he looked like. I said, he looks like Ernest Borgnine, for God's sake.
He thought he was going to be tall, first of all, and he was a little shorter than me at the time, and I was the shortest kid in my class. And he was just like this. He had this bulldog quality about him. Anyway, but there was a lot of people that were like these heroes or became heroes. People like Sergio Aragonés. I met when I was maybe 13, and wow. He was at a New York convention, and he went up to it. There was a blackboard there that probably had the schedule on it, and he proceeded to draw the whole entire convention, just because it was fun, and I get to witness people, adults, drawing for pleasure, having a job that it's clearly purely out of their enthusiasm. It's not that somebody like Jack Kirby, like half the time he talked about sales and what he was thinking about, like create this thing that makes good numbers, but they were all coming from a place of being in love with the forum, and I was so in love with it myself that it helped me see the road in a way that I think it's hard to imagine sometimes how these things can be careers, and I saw tons of that.
Yeah, it seems like you saw it before a lot of other people did.
Again, sort of the dumb luck of it. I don't know what it was about comics. My first interest, I wanted to be an entomologist. That was the first thing that struck me when I was 4. I think it was even Brood 10, the same one that just came around this year on the East Coast, of the cicadas. And they're climbing the trees. And my reaction to seeing them was, wow, cool, as opposed to, yeah. And I immediately got really interested in insects. And my dad got me a little plaque that I had on my table that said Peter Kuper, entomologist, which I only rue the fact that I threw that out, because I would have loved to have still had that little mock, like, that's my nameplate. And then comics had the same kind of impact, and I eased out of insects and into being enthusiastic about comics, but I really barely drew at all. I mean, I'd do a little scribbling here or there, but there was no anything to indicate any kind of ability. And I just was really.
I still have that trait. Nothing to indicate any kind of ability, but I run with it.
Well, that's a good thing to do. Yes.
Peter,
I'm always amazed when somebody can really draw from a young age.
Well, Peter, were you artistic when you went to Kent State, but was it Pratt Institute that turned a corner for you?
No, when I was in high school, I was in a program that was the early 70s thing. It was the direction of School Without Walls, the things they were experimenting with at the time. And it was called New School, which was dubbed by the people in the traditional school, because it was a high school of 3,000, but 320 people were in these 2 floors that had literally like partition walls, or, you know, they had students teaching classes. I taught a comics class when I was in, high school or junior high school. And it was, where was I going with this?
You were going to Kent State.
Yes. So weirdly, the only art classes were in the traditional school. And I went to the traditional school art teacher and said, could I take your class, when I was in 10th grade maybe? And he said, he looked down his nose at this alternative school program and he wouldn't let me into the class. And I started to draw when I was about 15, had a sketchbook, and I started, around the same time I started doing drugs probably. And getting into underground comics a lot and seeing alternative things like that. So I didn't have art classes, but I started to do more sketching. And at the end of high school, I had one of those like very dark moments where I thought, in the event of war, I'm a hostage. I have no obvious abilities, and what will I do? I mean, I'm not going to become an entomologist at this point. And so I thought, well, I'll run towards art. So I was applying to different schools, hoping to get some art program stuff. And I had no portfolio and really nothing to show for, what normally somebody who had 3 years of high school art would show. And I didn't get into any of the colleges of my choice. And my father was a teacher, and Kent State, being a state school, I could go there for basically free, except for room and board. And so it was sort of a last minute jump to Kent State. And Kent State, they actually had a decent art program, and I took some good art classes there, did stuff with linoleum prints, did some things that were something that I could recognize as in my work now. But part of it is it terrified me because it was really a jock school. It was like, for all the Kent State in the 70s, the shooting at Kent State that happened in 1970, I was there in 76. It was really a jock school. And what I think had happened was that that was at the point in the Vietnam War where they weren't just taking Black and Latino people to, send into the meat grinder. And they started going after people who normally could get out of going to war if they went to college. And they started going probably to people at state school, which is why I think that ended up being that was a flashpoint. It was a state school because it was really kind of very jockey school. And I just thought, this is so, the world is mostly like this. I don't like sports at all. Yes.
Did you try to get into Kenyon?
I think I did try Kenyon, and I tried University of Michigan and what was in Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon.
Oh, no OSU for you?
That would have been probably a good choice also. And it worked out really well because going to Kent State, I fell into a deep depression, realizing that most everybody was interested in sports. And I mean, truly, like, one of the reasons why I had so much time for comics was because I just never watched sports. I wasn't unathletic. I just had no interest whatsoever in watching sports.
Well, the Indians weren't doing well at the time.
They perhaps
was Dennis Kucinich.
Their mascot wasn't doing well.
No, was Kucinich the mayor then?
Kucinich was he the mayor then? Maybe at the tail end. I can't even remember now. I think he was, but I'm blanking now.
Now you can follow the Guardians.
I don't know. Anyway, at spring break, I was like, I have to get out of here. And I went to New York and went around to animation agencies because I had some very tentative connection with my cousin was a musician and had done some music for a small animation agency. And the guy there, I had shown my sketchbook to when I was 15. And he goes, like, hey kid, want some work? And that just stuck in my mind. And so I went straight to him. the animation industry was in a downturn, but he gave me the name of another place. I went around the corner because there was like an area of New York that was like animation houses. And I went to a place called Xander Animation. Bob Bleckman had an animation studio there, for example, in this area around 46th Street. And this guy at Xander Animation was working on Raggedy Ann and Andy. And he said he'd give me a job, painting.
What year was this?
76, 77.
Wow, that was scary New York too.
Super scary New York.
So Bob, what were you doing in New York in 76?
I was running from something because I was, it was very dangerous.
Jogging. We called it jogging.
Yeah, I was in the South Bronx.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was not pleasant. And Peter, did you wind up going to school then when you came to New York, or how long was it before you went to Pratt?
It was a year before I went to Pratt. I thought I was just going to get into animation, and what happened was when I arrived for this job. I mean, I moved to New York for this job. I was very fortunate. I'm privileged experience, but my uncle knew somebody who had a place in Brooklyn with an extra room, and I got a room with a shared bathroom in Brooklyn Heights, which was the least scary part of Brooklyn. And so I was able to move into a room, and it was like $100 a month at the time, and didn't have a kitchen. So, but the guy who I was renting from was an illustrator, as it turned out, and we became quite good friends. And so I moved for this job, and then I came in to see the guy. I couldn't get past the secretary, and then eventually I saw him like 6 weeks in, and he was like, "Oh, who are you again?" And then he was like, "No, the animation industry has crashed, and we're done with that movie, and I have no work for you." And I was like, "But I moved, I wrote you the letter. I moved here for this job." And so it was a classic, like, "Welcome." And
that's interesting, because when I first started getting published in the New Yorker, Bob actually said this: "Michael, we like your work. Don't move to New York." And now I live in Manitowoc, Wisconsin.
So trying to get him to move further away.
I've tried, but
you need to have perspective. See, you got perspective that we don't have here.
Exactly. I have Lake Michigan to look at.
Now, Peter, where was your friend in all of this? Because he became sort of a partner with your co-founder.
Yeah.
Was he also a Pratt classmate?
So what happened was, when I went to Kent, he moved to New York and went to NYU, and he wanted to be a filmmaker. This is Seth DeBachman. And filmmaking, he just found it really difficult to juggle all that, getting people to places and all the planning that you have to do, and getting the equipment and how expensive it is to do a film. And he was, and I started at Pratt, and we had kind of fallen out. Actually, I think we fell out over the fanzine. We just had disagreements over, typical, it was like a teenage breakup over, like I like this, you like that, and so we both moved to New York, and we kind of talked to each other, but not a lot. But then he saw that I was still interested in comics, and he was interested in comics, and we just kind of, the magnet of comics brought us back together. And then I started going to Pratt, and he was like, I think I want to go to art school and not film school. And he joined me at Pratt at probably a year after I went there. And then we very quickly started talking about doing another magazine together, because we were both interested in comics, and we could not get them published anywhere. I was doing these involved comics, and then take them. The only place I could find was like heavy metal, or the underground comic scene had crashed. I mean, I felt like we were just in the generation where we'd arrive at the beach just in time for the medical waste to wash up. And it was like, "Oh, sorry. Oh, God, it was so beautiful. It was a great sunset. You missed it." And it was same thing happened to me traveling. I'd go to some country, and they'd always tell you, every time they tell you, "Oh, you should have seen the place 10 years ago." I got very sick of that. And I tried not to do it myself. I probably have occasionally, but it's kind of like always, it seems to be always the case. These things are continuously crashing. I try to take solace in that. Admittedly, right now we're in a period for as a cartoonist where it takes a lot of scrambling to make it happen. But I read a book about cartoonists. I think it was called "Jumping Up and Down on the Roof and Throwing Water Balloons." It was interviews with New Yorker cartoonists. And they were talking in 76, they were talking about how the whole industry had crashed and there was no work. And it was like B. Cliben, who did, the Cats and
Yes.
and Rodriguez, and it was all the guys that I loved. I know Gain Wilson.
Well, I think the industry is always crashing in some form or another.
Yeah, and you always have to find this win your way. Their water will have to flow, and you have to do this so it's kind of a crazy dance to make things work.
Peter, when you came to Pratt, you made a big impact though, because when I came years later, your reputation there was still there. People talked about World War III. I mean, that's what everyone talked about, like in the illustration department.
Really?
And that's where I went through. I wasn't a comic. I was not into cartoons, but your mark was very impressive.
I was unaware of that, honestly. I wasn't conscious of that impact. Actually, weirdly, I decided to start a magazine when I was at Pratt besides World War III called Ubiquitous, which was this intended to be like something that was going to pull all the different art departments and everything together. And I felt like all the different departments were separated. And it was also a time when it was so weird because drawing comics was discouraged. It wasn't encouraged when I was in art school. And the people that were going to art school at that time included Dan Klaus and in the people who ended up in the more superhero range, like Kent Williams and George Pratt. And there's these people who ended up having impacts in these fields. But at the time, they didn't have anything they didn't teach you about doing a portfolio. I learned about putting together an illustration portfolio from another student who you mentioned, which I was thrilled. And you sent me here are some questions. You mentioned Mike Bartalos. So this is an illustrator at the time that, I don't know if anybody will know his work, but he was so fantastic. There was so much possibilities in the illustration field at that time that I was completely unaware of. And I don't remember the illustration department really informing us how we went about doing that. Like, how did you put together a portfolio? How do you contact an art director? These kinds of things. And this guy, Mike Bartalos, had started doing it as a junior. He started getting work at the New York Times. And my heart just stopped with jealousy and enthusiasm. I was just like, you're in the New York Times now? What? And,
well, there was a bunch of superstars then. I don't know how many people know these names, but Kent Williams was huge then. And so was Dan, who made Ghost World.
Yeah.
And I don't know if people knew that connection, but these people were highly successful.
Yeah, people went out into the field. And what it sort of showed was that a lot of it is just kind of like your own. College, I'm so happy I went to art school. I have to say, I never graduated. I spent 5 years in college and never graduated. I also went to the Art Students League, by the way. When I first got to New York, I panicked when the fall came around and I wasn't in school. And I was like, I read Norman Rockwell's autobiography and he went to there and I'm going there. And that's actually where Seth and I reconnected. We both ended up going there.
Peter, when I look at your work, the first person I think of is Norman Rockwell. It's just got that.
It's the politics, really.
It touches my heart. Your work's very painterly, so I am surprised you never, started strapping together some 6x6 canvases and going at it.
Well, we talked about Peter's technique at the Village Voice, where I met Michael. That's where I met Michael Bartalos. Although I missed him at Pratt and I missed you, but I want to mention quickly the old story was that when survey came around, which survey is when everyone in this class has to put up their work from the semester and show what they accomplished. And Michael put on the board all these clips from all these major magazines. And Jerry Contreras came over screaming, saying,
head of the department.
Head of the department saying, you take that down. You take Mr. Reagan, take down that wall. And they insisted he took down that wall. But then Michael painted the walls at the Village Voice. Did you know he painted Wes Anderson's office? Wes Anderson, the deceased art director.
Yeah. I probably, we're going down the rabbit hole of history here. Yeah, I think I remember. Yes, I do.
And that's where I met you.
It's so funny. We had all these various connections. I miss aspects of this in a big way. Like it used to be that the New York Times had 12 drawing tables, and I had my own pass to get into the New York Times. I'd go there. I brought my parents at one point. We went down to the bottom of the building where you could watch them print the paper with the drawing that you did earlier in the day or evening. I mean, I was up there working, and it was truly exciting, but it was also really stressful. And when the fax machine came in, going way back, where you could like actually get the article sent to you, I used to have to, in the same day, go down, pick up the article, go back home. I often did, read the article on the subway, then do a sketch, then run back down, show a sketch, then run back home to do a finish, then run back down to deliver the final, all in the same day. Sure. It was just, this was, the pre-computer world was it involved a lot of that, but it also involved a lot of direct communication. I knew all these art directors. I had, I'd be up at the New York Times, and just by being there, somebody would go, "Oh, hey, you want a job?"
Yeah.
Weirdest circumstance of getting employed. And there'd literally be a bullpen on a Friday. There'd be crowds of illustrators there all working on these, Saturday, Sunday paper and these crazy deadlines. And if you got your sketch approved, you were calm, and there was the guy next to you sweating bullets. That was usually me trying to come up with an idea, and you'd be bringing sketches in and getting them turned down. It was really, but it was super exciting, and I missed that on one count, and I like everything that the circumstances that allows me to say be in Mexico and do a job and send it in by I can email a job in, like when I was doing Spy vs. Spy for Mad, which only, by the way, just ended like a couple of months ago. I did my last issue.
Oh, who won?
What? Actually,
Spy won.
I did try to kill them, have them kill them both off.
Kill them and kill each other. Yeah,
I did. I brought it to very close to the edge. They wanted to leave the door open for the possibility of.
Oh, you could just make it ambiguous. They both fall over, but
I did something very much like that. Yes.
Ah.
In fact, that was my intention, was to have a really big finale, go out with a boom, literally. But when I was doing Spy vs. Spy, I was delivering original art, which they took and they put on a drum. It was flexible art, and they were doing that all, they'd scan it. So I always was having to go down to the office, which was fine, of course, because I was going down to Mad Magazine, which is, a half a dream and half a nightmare. And then it was just when I moved to Mexico for 2 years in 2006 with my wife and daughter. And that was just at a point where I was like talking to Sam Viviano, who you've had on the show, and saying like, I can email the art. I really can. And, I had been emailing art to people for a long time, but they were used to me delivering the original art. And it was just at that juncture, and there was just enough technology in Mexico too that I could keep going. So I love aspects of the modern world, and I miss a lot of what was.
Yeah. I mean, well, I remember you and me staying sometimes up all night at the Village Voice, and we'd be on hold waiting for a job that someone might need. and they would just say, jump in. But you brought up so many different things that trigger questions. One is Mad Magazine. When you were growing up, was Mad an influence on you? And was that a dream?
I didn't even, I guess it was. I mean, I just didn't even visualize it because Mad was such a closed shop. It was like all the same people always. And I did not approach them. It was this strange kismet or whatever occurred at this point in 1996. I had just done a book called The System for DC Vertigo. And it was another one of those weird things. I managed to get my foot in the door. There was an editor who had a job rather briefly there, named Lou Stathis. And I had worked with him on every magazine he'd worked on. This is one of the funny things, is like, it's really, I teach and I say these kinds of things to students, but I did work for free for people. And then I'd work for the tiniest magazine they were working on. And then you'd watch somebody, like there was a guy named Mark Michelson who worked at High Times. And then the next job he had was Newsweek. And that, it was like, and then, he was hiring me at Newsweek to do, covers and illustrations. And so I just found like there was a lot of times where you just by being with somebody or being around, but this editor who moved to DC Vertigo, he had been like had known him for years, and we were just comic fans together. And then he kept on, he was in an editorial way, and he said, hey, he asked me to pitch something to DC, and I had this developing concept that had literally been like a little folder in my file for years, something involving the different political events that had happened. It was like Son of Sam, which had happened when I first moved to New York. I mean, I moved to New York at a rather critical juncture. I arrived when there was a garbage strike. It was a 2-week garbage strike. This is in 1977. I think within 2 weeks, a blackout happened that the town got just completely torn up. It was just rioting and stores being ripped apart, and people were selling merchandise on the streets for the next several months. And Son of Sam was wandering around in Brooklyn and killing people. There'd be movies about this. And, he wasn't far from killing people, far from where I was living. And it was like the whole vibe of New York was like Shaft or Taxi Driver. And I really did have a rather deep respect for how dangerous it was, but it was sort of like, it made me really nervous and really thrilled. Like I really felt like I was walking through a movie set, which I have to admit, I still kind of feel being in New York, which is why I still feel this incredible sense of, I feel like I'm traveling living in New York because it's always changing. It gets cleaner, it gets dirtier, empty stores, full places, whatever. But I've totally lost it. Once again, I've lost my train of thought here.
Don't worry, you're in New York. No one will notice.
Exactly. It's not important either. It's just interesting to hear your point of view.
Yeah, stream of consciousness over here.
I was going to go backwards just for a moment about your technique, even though it seems a little bit superficial after talking about what you're saying about New York.
Actually, I just remember what I was going to say, and it applies.
Let me let you go.
Which is, I was doing the system. So I had all these stories that had been collecting going back to when I first arrived, and I pieced them together in this idea. And when this editor at Vertigo, DC Vertigo, said, "Hey, do you have any story ideas?" I presented this idea called the system, and I thought, like, how many different things can I do that are not traditional for comics? And one of them was being wordless. Another one was stencil and spray paint, which I had been doing in my illustration work. And I did one graphic novel. I did an adaptation of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle for Classics Illustrated. And I was experimenting with that the idea of doing what I was trying to experiment with in my illustration and bringing it into comics. And it was a real pain in the ass to do this, because I literally am cutting paper and the holes, and I was using spray cans, like super toxic enamel spray paint, but it achieves a look that you just can't get any way other than that, pretty much. I mean, probably these days you can pull it off with a computer, and I do to the extent that I take old spray paint images and then I overlay them on my illustrations sometimes. But I was doing this technique, and I was doing this wordless. I did this whole wordless graphic novel for Vertigo, and Mad had moved into the building with DC. They were bought by Time Warner, and although the editor told me that he had seen a travel book I did called Comic Trips, I'm pretty sure that the fact that I did this wordless book played into them asking me to try out for Spy vs. Spy. And I really did not think I wanted the job, because I felt like I was launching in this direction. I was doing my own thing. Why would I want to do somebody else's characters, etc.? And this was kind of a thing from my childhood. It wasn't like, is this something that I want, that's up to date with the kind of things I'm doing? But they were like, they're going to pay me to do a trial. And I was like, okay, I'll try, what do I have to lose? But I'm going to do it in stencils and spray paint, which is guaranteed to make them not want to have me do it. But I will, if I get the job, I will be doing something that isn't just simply mimicking the style of Antonio Proquias, the guy who created it. It was doing it in pen and ink. And it turned out that was like, the golden, chocolate card, because they didn't want somebody to do just exactly the same thing. They wanted something different, and I landed in the right spot. And I thought I'd do it for a year or two, and I did it for 25 years. So weird, but.
Well, Peter, what were the size of the finishes if you're doing stencil and spray paint?
Well, because I was really into the idea that the art, that the stencil, the spray paint wouldn't reduce and therefore look like it was like airbrush. I wanted the grittiness of it. I did it same size. So let me see.
So those are like the world's smallest stencils.
Yeah,
well, it just happens. Here's what one looks like.
Oh,
and that's a stencil spray paint.
To our podcast audience, Peter's showing a really, really cool.
Oh, sorry.
It
Original
looks beautiful.
Yes.
That only we enjoy.
And you can see, and this is what a stencil look like for those. It's a radio thing. You can really see the stencil. That is
Yes.
looking at it backwards. So I sprayed it in red, and first in red paint, and then in black paint. And what you get is this great underspray quality that I did in like all my illustrations for a long time. And it was such a cool technique. And it was like, and remains super toxic because it's enamel paint.
Yeah. So did you keep the windows open, or?
I'm sure my neighbors loved me as I was like a restaurant blowing their, barbecued smoke out the window.
And I noticed your avatar is smoking.
It's a pencil, actually.
Oh, I thought it was I thought it was a cheroot.
I know.
Peter, that's what I was going to ask you about, and you just brought it up yourself. And I've seen you work. I had the privilege of watching you use the stencils, and I just wanted to make a point of it because it was fascinating for so many of us to watch you work like that. No one else was doing that, and we all did wonder if you abandoned that technique for safety reasons.
It was a two-pronged thing. Safety was number one. I moved to Mexico, as I mentioned, in 2006, and was going to stay for a year and stayed in this town called Oaxaca for 2 years. Just a quick rollback. When I was 10, my father, as a teacher, had a sabbatical, and we moved to Israel for a year. And that kind of set me on the road for all the travel that I ended up doing, and learning a second language, and just the whole being an outsider. And I got my ass kicked a lot, and I had to change schools. I had a lot of trouble with language. And so when my daughter was getting to that age, I thought I want her to have the same experience. So but a better, more useful, utile language, and Spanish was a natural. And we actually checked out Spain and realized we basically live scramble even harder in Europe than we would in New York. And then suddenly it was like, wait, Mexico, gee, it's really close. And we very randomly chose this town, Oaxaca. And that was another one of those surprise, incredibly good fortune things, because Oaxaca is really one of the pearls of Mexico. Cortez chose that as the place to have his domain when the conquistadors came in. And just to bring entomology into it, it became a very wealthy town because there was this insect called the cochineal bug that, when crushed, it's a little tiny bug that you find on cactus. And when you crush it, it makes this incredible reddish purple dye that was the royal red. And it was used in Renaissance paintings. It was used as all the royal reds. It was the red stripes in the first US flag. Van Gogh used it as part of his paint color. It's in food now. It's called carmine. So you'll find it in Yoplait yogurt to make the tint of pink in it. And until they figured out how to synthesize it for a few hundred years, it was gold. And the conquistadors kept it secret. And it made the town incredibly, it got built up because of that. And it's this gorgeous town. So we moved there with our daughter, and sorry, my wonderful wandering brain here. Remind me where I was going with this again.
Doesn't matter. Looking at your wall, I think you're more an anthropologist than a bug guy.
Well, that's right. You're seeing on my wall is a bunch of masks, and that travel. I remember where I was going. Thank you for jogging.
You were going to Oaxaca.
I went to Oaxaca, but the reason why I brought that up was living in Mexico. I was doing more and more drawing in my sketchbook and watercolors and things that weren't stencil and spray paint. And the main thing I had to do in stencil and spray paint was Spy versus Spy. And every time I came around to doing it, I was like, oh, this again. And oh my God, it's so toxic. And I had done 3 graphic novels that way. Besides the system, I also did one called Sticks and Stones, and I'd done a million illustrations. And so when I got back from Mexico, I just decided that I'd really like to not, had gone through a full shift. Plus we got back just in time for the crash, and my whole career completely tanked, and I had no work. My illustration career died, and I no longer was interested in the part of where stencils and spray paint worked. Was I was talking about in particular, 8 years of Bush and Iraq and Afghanistan, and I had a lot of great angry illustrations that came through. Stylistically, it fit with my mood, and coming out of the 80s also in New York, and the kind of graffiti aspect of it. And I was going through the shift where I had just been exposed to the watercolory, beautiful, colorful world of Mexico. And I wanted to pursue that, but I just didn't know how to sort of maintain the sort of political edge of the work, but I just wasn't there. And at one point in my career, I had gotten very interested in collage, and I was doing like these cubist collagey things. And at another point I was doing scratchboard, and then stencil came in, and it just it's nice to have these natural shifts, but sometimes they're like doom, because you have to figure out, okay, in this new natural shift, what's my career?
Well, your style is very adaptive to whatever your content or material is. It's pretty amazing. I look at it and I see like 7 different people. Well, I would not know it's you.
That can be a really troubling thing. And it was my biggest question for other illustrators when I was coming up, because when I started, that was like, it came across as indecision. I really felt lost a lot of the time. Like, I want to do this. I'd see something else I liked. I wanted to go in that direction. Steinberg completely blew me out of the water. Like at the final year of art school, I looked at Steinberg, and I was doing like linoleum prints. And I really think I would have had a lot of work. And in fact, I was getting work doing that for the New York Times. But then I was looking at Steinberg and seeing these conceptual things in collage and watercolors and painting and just everything. And I wanted to do that, but it hadn't coalesced yet. And stencil kind of brought that together for me, because in my stencil, like I would do a very conceptual idea. The stencil would hold it stylistically. Then I'd slap some collage on there and add watercolor. And it was like,
see,
in my sketch.
Peter, you should do what Bob did for Steinberg. Just steal it.
Oh, I did. I assure you.
Just steal it.
Oh, I did straight, like pretty much any illustrator worth their salt. Everybody, you're stealing from Picasso, you're stealing from Steinberg stealing from Picasso, maybe, or not, but although he was pretty goddamn original.
But everyone starts that way.
That's the part of the flow of stylistic sharings.
Right.
I think it starts that way for everyone. Everyone who starts off, students are always asking the same questions. Can you change your techniques and stuff? Are you allowed? But I mean, you maintain your same voice. You always have the strong political voice. You always demonstrate how much a cartoonist can have a say politically. And so when you change techniques, though, it's still you. And I feel like people can switch the methods as long as their voice comes through in some way. And everyone can imitate people in the beginning. I think that's a natural growth. That's a natural part of learning. And then you find your own way of having your own voice.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that, but what I think does happen is with time, you don't know what your voice is when you're younger. I mean, you're in the midst of developing it. And I've lost my sense of what my voice is. Like when I got back from Mexico, I had a what felt like kind of a lost several years where I was trying to figure out how to, like, I have no B plan. I sold my comic collection. I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to like figure out a scramble here. You know, I live in New York, and I mean, my wife also works, but we're in tandem to make, you know, livings so that we can continue to stay here. And you know, so I was in a big scramble, and while in the midst of that change, and so that, you know, it can, that part of it can be pretty stressful. But I kept finding, and I consistently have found that pursuing things that I love, and comics has been a really big part of that, is I just sort of actually shifted where I had been doing all these illustration jobs, which really was my bread and butter. And that in some ways doing comics was almost hobbyist for easily a decade, but probably more like 20 years on and off, because World War III, which we're now in our 42nd year of publication, we've had to put money into it. Nobody gets paid. If I edit an issue, it just means I get to do more work and then do the art that I don't get paid for. But so often things like that, that's how I developed a voice, was doing things that had some value to me, that there was no commercial constraint to, and that it mostly meant having to run twice as fast, you know, work 7 days a week, which is ultimately really okay with me, because I do sort of lose my way. Drawing is my solution to getting depressed about everything that's going on. And by responding to what's happening in the world, which is, you know, I am staring into the abyss entirely too much. But when I draw, I'm just like, that's just deep relief. And so when I don't draw, then it starts to, I start to I'm just looking at the problem, and I'm not seeing the solutions. And the art is kind of, at least on a personal level, it's a solution, but I also feel it's a good way.
Peter, did you ever go for the classic newspaper editorial cartoonist kind of gig?
Absolutely. I mean, I did. I had a strip in the New York Daily News for 2 years. It was an editorial strip. I, you know, again, sort of like stumbled into it. I think Jules Pfeiffer had recommended me to the editor, who had asked Pfeiffer to do it, or just was looking for somebody. And I did that. Yeah, I did that for a couple of years, and then self-syndicated it out to alternative papers. I did a strip for the New York Times in 1993 called Eye of the Beholder, that was that lasted for 6 months, but then I did it for 10 years for alternative papers. I ended up with, you know, all of about 10 papers, but that was sort of like a kind of the weekly editorial cartoon.
Did you ever have a go at the classic single panel, you know, Liberty has liberty written on her, justice, no. You know, like
no, that is the thing I avoided, is that I never really liked that kind of cartoon. It always sort of bummed me out that everything had a label on it. It's like, you'd see, it's, you know, it's Bush and it says Bush on his shirt, and
yes,
you know, like how can you do that same thing? I'm much more interested in symbols and the power of symbols than and labels are just that's the one line that I have not like super consciously drawn, but it's just like
it's funny. Your classic, most traditional editorial style, I think, is coming through from the daily cartoons you're doing at the New Yorker.
Those are very much coming out of that same thing. It's just finding a way to not have it be with labels. And I think that probably, I mean, if you started labeling things, none of those would really probably go through there anyway. But it's my inclination, so that's good fortune.
Well, the Lampoon used to do one where they do a editorial cartoon and put like 150 labels on it.
That can be that can be an amusing approach also.
Yes, it works about 3 times. And then you go like, exactly, okay.
Exactly. The Onion does a parody that way.
Ward Sutton has his
right
cartoon. And he does it. It's like a stodgy old guy, you know, the old school cartoonist who everything's labeled.
Right.
The label has a label on it. I
was doing the Daily News after you left. And between us was Tom Hackman, I think.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he was doing it for Josh Greenman. That was the editor I was working for at the time. And he probably came in after you.
That sounds, I think, yeah. I think he was after me. Or, I mean, they had a regular editorial cartoon thing, but they were, they were in the midst of, they were kind of a shift. The Daily News always struck me as being kind of like the New York Post until I started working there. And then it was kind of like that. And the editors moved around a few times, and they clearly hated my political perspective. And the best I could get out of one editor was, it's cute. Like,
oh, you love to hear that, don't you?
Oh yeah, no, that's my dream political response. Ooh, that's cute.
I'm sure they didn't hate you. I'm sure it was just a case of just so many cooks in the kitchen. It's almost impossible to have everyone on the same page.
Well, it's, this is one of the things that also happens. I mean, I periodically, certainly with the New Yorker, I feel on and off like I'm just, they want to take a breath and not have it be some political scree. And I'm having more and more trouble not talking about, especially climate change, but things that are like, it all feels so urgent that I'm just finding like Marty knows this better than anybody. Just about every other cartoon I pitch him has to do with climate change.
Every time something big happens, though, it's funny because if I'm not paying attention to the news, I get my news from what people submit to me, and I'll know something's happening because I'll get like cartoons on it, I'll get satire pieces on it, and I'm like, oh, what happened? And I'll just like get a bunch of this stuff, and I'm like, what does this stuff mean? And Peter has a wonderful takes on many topics, and I'll get all of them, especially the climate change stuff all came in. And actually that stuff all came in, and a friend of mine, Casey Rand, who's a very funny comedy writer, and she started working at I guess it's like maybe like a creative agency that started just to make messaging about getting people's asses in gear about climate change. And like she was over at like a big time agency like Droga 5 or something, and then she left and came to I kind of think of them like almost like the Lincoln Project, but for climate change, or just like a think tank that's like for messaging, and they like make ads. Like that's all they're doing is making ads. So your two most recent climate change cartoons that came in, I forwarded them to Casey, and I was like, you should talk to this guy. Like he's very passionate about doing, single panel cartoons. They're beautiful with great messaging. And, she was like, these are great. Thanks. I mean, if they go in that way, eventually, I think that you'll be kind of the person to call for that kind of like art. I think mostly they were just working on advertising design. Your stuff's very, very impactful.
Well, I'm hoping to be the end of the doomsday end of the world guy.
Yeah, but how do you feel when, I saw you sold your first trope of the guy on the desert island?
Oh, well, tropes are
my
symbols.
My first desert island cartoon.
Peter had a great one right when COVID started. He sent one over for Weekly Humorist, and I loved it. And it was a guy on the desert island. It was a cruise ship to save him, and the guy was like, "I'm good, thanks.
I'm fine.
I'm good."
These are, I really, really like symbols. I like things that do that, and then it's a question of like, which way can you turn a symbol on its head? But it's our collective consciousness thing. And in the cartooning world, that there's a ton of those. There's the guy with the end of the world sign, desert island, of course.
Oh, there's a classic, and I don't think this person's ever had another cartoon in the New Yorker, and it was a cartoon issue, and it was these two guys on a desert island and these people in a boat, like a bunch of like 6 people side by side, and they're all drawing. He's saying, "Oh, damn, they're cartoonists. They're not going to do anything."
Yeah, it's amazing how bottomless some of these tropes are. They really, and when somebody does a new version of it, it's really, I enjoy that. But it's really, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's difficult to not be, have alarmist qualities in cartooning, and I keep on trying to find ways to talk about this that has some kind of humor, because it's you sort of desperately need, even in a concentration camp, somebody has got to crack a joke. Like, we got to break the tension here, people.
Oh yeah, well, one of my more popular cartoons are the two guys chained up, and then one guy says to the other one, "TGIF."
Well, I mean, I think I had a book that by Shel Silverstein.
Yes.
And it was called Here's My Plan. It's two guys chained to a wall, and it was Here's My Plan.
That's a fabulous trope too. I've done tons of those. Like the two guys, like there's one guy next to him in a suit, and they go, "Oh, have you met the new intern?" Can't sell that one.
It's quality. That's quality material.
Yes.
Yeah, but anyway, I do find periodically, like, I think I'm just, I'm now becoming too much of a bummer.
No, Peter, I'm on the same page. I feel exactly, I totally agree what you say, because look, we're living through the most amazing time in history. Why is the cartoonist's voice not a part of expressing what's going on? I mean, I go through batches where I just want to do something about global warming on all the cartoons because I feel the same urgency and have to fight that. And so I know exactly where you're coming from. And when I see your cartoons as a daily cartoon, I'm always delighted to see your take on it, because I feel like finally someone's not backing off and doing something that's just totally lame.
That would be my cartoon, because I completely avoid the subjects.
I didn't want to bring up your name, but yes.
Yeah. No, I had the Gulf War. So back in the day, like 2002, I mean, New Yorker political cartoons would never mention anything political. We would just like skirt right up next to it and then stop. So like I had
that was a tradition until about 1993. In 1993, they started bringing in bits and pieces of that, and this or that. There'd be a couple of things that they would throw into it. I don't know. They'd have a Tom Tomorrow back page. The back page was doing some more interesting things. But anyway, these things always are shifting around, and especially at the New Yorker, they're constantly
right. My edgy cartoon back then was a couple watching television, and the woman says, "I like the theme song to the Gulf War better." Because back then CNN would have, I said, if it's a really serious event, they would invent a theme song for it. So you would always hear that over and over again.
They got really quick with those. It's absolutely true. I'm trying to marry these things together and still say like long form. I mean, part of it is like doing comics is so difficult. It takes so much energy. So I have to find subject matter that I feel like I can have a sustain of what, could be years. I did a book called Ruins that was really very much about my time in Mexico. I turned it into a fictional account of a couple moving to Mexico, and I threw into it the monarch butterflies' migration down to Mexico. And it took me, years of thinking about it and starting and stopping, going, this is just impossible. I don't know how I can do this project. Afford to do this project, but it just kept on. I think it's a lucky thing if something annoys you enough to finally be forced to do it.
Well, sorry, Peter. I was listening to your podcast on what was it? The Drunk Muse. What was this one called?
Drunken. Yeah.
Oh, anyway, yeah. You say you work on something so long, and it's so daunting. And it's such a slog that you reach a delusional point where you go like, oh yeah, everything's going to be fine. It's going to be good.
Well, it's, or the other thing is I finish a book and put it on a shelf and I can't look at it because it horrifies me to open it up. I don't like anything I see in it. And that comes and goes. I mean, I think that's another, thing I say as a teacher to students is the artist doesn't know. You don't know what's going to, certainly not for posterity, but you may not know what it is that you do well. You might, like I came to hate linoleum prints. There's a look that's in certain work that I just like rejected and wanted to get away from. It's just part of kind of a growing process. But then I'll look back on it and go, oh, I actually may even return to it and come back around. And even doing New Yorker cartoons, I realized like I wanted to be a New Yorker cartoonist. I moved to New York thinking I want to be a New Yorker cartoonist, and I was submitting probably starting in 81 or something like that, and just rejection, nothing, and it just seemed like an impossible hill to climb. And I gave up and then started again and again. And but it was really, I really studied New Yorker cartoons a lot. And I had forgotten that almost completely until it came back around again. And then it's like all of that information, all the aspects of it is really one more, it's one more slow of the 7 me's you referred to. It's, one of them is completely a New Yorker fan, and that information is in there.
You had all that residue built up.
Yeah, and it didn't, I wasn't touching that area. I didn't think to myself like, oh, gag cartooning, that's for me. But then it came up in, right before the previous election, and it was like, that it's fitting with the kind of writing I want to do, shorter things, the kind of energy you get out of pitching and the horror that you get out of pitching all fit together. What I was going to say though was, as far as comics go, so right now I'm working on a new ridiculous project that will take me years to do. And it was coalescing for years, like a lot of these things do. And it brought in my enthusiasm for entomology. And it's about the intersection between people and insects. And I can bring into that aspects of all the environmental catastrophes that are going on, but also this sort of incredible life and history of insects, but also the incredible people who study them for hundreds of years. There's a female entomologist named Maria Sibylla Marion, who in the 1600s went with her daughter, went to Suriname, and she did these incredible drawings, but then she made prints and made these books. And there's a handful of the original books left, and I got to see one at the New York Public Library because I got a fellowship there. And I spent the last 12 months in this fellowship studying work like that and working on this sort of vague project that was going to be about insects and all. And what happened was I got to the library with COVID going on, and nobody could get into the library unless you had a pass. And there was this group of people who got this fellowship that a handful of cartoonists have gotten before. Gary Panter had it one year, and Dash Shaw, David Sandlin, Ben Catcher got it at one point. And I arrived there and I was like, oh great, here it is I arrive at the beach just in time for the medical waste to wash up. And I couldn't have conversations with the other 14 fellows that were there, who were all these really interesting people. We were basically told not to stand in the middle of the room and talk to each other. We had to wear masks if we weren't in our tiny little offices. But it turned out to be this incredible silver lining, because the library was empty. And I started walking around and taking pictures of the rooms. And so the Rose Room, for example, was completely empty. And I'd be the only person in there. And I could see parts of the collection, and I would be the only person. And then whenever you went in the library, there was no one in there. And so my story kind of shifted over to this post-apocalyptic world where the only thing that can enter the library are the insects that have survived.
I was going to describe this as Kafkaesque, but I avoided it.
It's super Kafkaesque, and it fits in with, anyway, it was one of those things where I had a lot of different pieces of things I was thinking about and wanting to include biographies of these people, like Rachel Carson or Maria Sibylla Marion, or Nabokov was an entomologist, along with being having written Lolita.
So supposedly Lolita's structure was the plot structure was that of a butterfly.
It makes perfect sense, and he had made a number of discoveries that they only figured out were true after he died, when they could do DNA tests on butterflies, and but there's all these. So what I'm looking for in what I'm doing is, how can I talk about these things, not have it be like a scold, like boy, we people are horrible and cancer on this world, but at the same time point up the value of nature, but also the people that have recognized it over, the centuries. And, Aristotle was studying insects, for, like incredibly long time. They thought, like literally thousands of years, they thought that all the stages of the insects were separate, like that the caterpillar was one thing, completely separate creature.
Yes.
That like a maggot went inside of meat, and then a fly was a separate thing. And they thought that meat is what made the insects, not that there was a metamorphosis. And it wasn't until people like Maria Sibylla Merian came along and actually watched the metamorphosis and studied it and then drew it, that people went, oh, wait, really? And these are, some of these people, the entomologists, are people that people generally don't know. And so I'm really interested in that, which is very much like, I see entomology and comics as meeting. There's a Venn diagram of people who are interested in comics and people who are interested in entomology are really actually quite similar. And one of the joys that I've found is I can reach out to like the most famous entomologists, and they'll be like, oh, cool, you're doing what with insects? Great. And, I have a Zoom call next week with the guy who wrote the book that I'm reading on insects, who worked for the American Museum of Natural History. So it's a real thrill.
See, and all I would do is like a cartoon of two praying mantis, and the one says, it's so hard being a single mom. I wish I hadn't eaten their father.
Did you do that cartoon? That's a good one.
Oh yeah, I've never sold it. But there's a famous Danny Shanahan where there's one praying mantis and the other one's got no head, and she's saying, you slept with her, didn't you? I mean, the praying mantis is like
a great trope.
I have the other one I have, which I've never stole, which I keep pitching and pitching and pitching, is I've seen a version of it now. It's the butterfly talking to the cocoon, and the butterfly saying, you're not ready yet. So that's as far as I go with, that's my Werner Herzog moment.
The down or upriver moment.
Hey, Peter, have you ever done any animation stuff with your characters and ideas and drawings, just to adapt your very narrative style and very underground comic look? And, you did animation when you first came to the city, you got into it. And then did you ever go back to it?
Well, actually, I never got into it when I came to the city because that job never transpired. I never actually got to do the animation there. HBO optioned a book I did for Fantagraphics. I think I got paid, probably $500 for doing an entire book. And but thankfully, HBO was starting to get an animation in the late 90s, and they did a really terrible show. They did Spawn. They took this superhero comic Spawn and did it as an animated show. I don't know how well or poorly it did, but Ralph Bakshi did this horrible side anthology show, but they optioned this book Stripped, which was my autobiography, and I had a story about losing my virginity and doing drugs and all this, and we got as far. It was really like this amazing experience, and when it died after like a year and a half, it was really hard to recover from that. But they had it got as far as an animatic. They designing characters. I went out there. The guy who was the director for the Miyazaki films was doing the voiceover direction. The guy who played the writer on the Larry Sanders Show was playing me. And they had who's the actress who she has a show, I think it's called Better Things. Fantastic. Adelon. She worked with Louis C.K. Anyway, great. Lorraine Newman was doing voices who was in the original Saturday Night Live, and it was just this exciting thing and it got as far as the animatic, and then the entire animation department collapsed, and everybody moved over to Futurama, and I got to watch and go, oh, wait for me, and that disappeared. And then I had one other animation job, which was I got hired to teach at Harvard. I taught a comics class there starting in 2011. And two of the professors there, one of them was literally a rocket scientist, and the other one was he's like one of the heads of the art department. We're working on a documentary film about the light, upbeat topic, the disposal of nuclear waste. And they asked me if I wanted to do animation for it. And the United States hired futurists to come up with how can we show people in the future not to dig where we've buried this nuclear waste that's dangerous for 25,000 years. And so I got to do all these sci-fi fantasy things. I was having a lot of fun doing it, figuring out the animation on that for this really super depressing documentary. And I did quite a bit of work on that, and they used a small part of it, but that was the last animation project I worked on.
You could put a Walmart on it. No one wants to go in there.
That might, in 25,000 years, maybe we'll, the big idea was to build like a Disneyland over the site. And then you'd create a character that would be like Mickey Mouse, but his name Nicky Nuke. And it would be totally, and I had him like kind of a panda bear / nuclear, the design looked like a nuclear warning symbol.
I'm seeing it. I am.
And I know some guys over at, I worked on a show and we developed with some friends of mine who run an animation studio, this guy who runs it named Aaron Augenblick Studios, and they're over in Dumbo.
He's one of my students.
He's great. I went to college with his younger brother. He and I went to Syracuse together. So I've known Aaron since I've known his brother, Adam. And when I was in school, Aaron just a little bit older. So he was at SVA, I believe.
Yeah, that's where he was my student.
Oh, that's amazing. He makes great stuff. And I know that, obviously they're a fan of yours. And every time.
Super great. Well, no, when he started his animation studio, he contacted me. And that was in my dark period of post-Mexico, before I kind of crawled out into a new style. And he asked me if I had any ideas to pitch. And I had this whole huge concept with robots and all this stuff that I pitched him. And he did some animation of it. Actually, you reminded me. And he animated the characters. And I pitched, we were pitching it to Cartoon Network, and it never went anywhere there. And then I pitched it to DC Comics, and it never went anywhere there. And I did quite a lot of work on that, and it's all in a drawer.
Hey, you never know though. The world the world right now is so thirsty for adult animation. Like it's become this huge renaissance of kid animation. Yes, it's very popular, but like adult animation has exploded of this need now, and all the streaming networks are just like buying up all the great. And your stuff is so, I think, adaptable to animation.
We shall see.
We got to work on something, Peter Kuper. We'll put together something.
Okay, well, from your lips to the animation god's ear.
Next project.
Next project.
And also, did you ever do stuff? Because my first job in New York City, because I was an illustration major at Syracuse. My first print job, I had a weekly spot in the New York Press.
Sure.
Which was an alt weekly, and lots of great people were coming out of alt weeklies like that. And there was a great illustrator named Mike Wartella, who's like an underground comic artist, and he did a little bit of stuff for Mad. He did a Mad cover, I think, maybe in the last 2 years.
Uh-huh.
And then, so you were a Village Voice person a little bit?
I did a lot. I did a ton of stuff for The Voice, and I think I did a couple of covers for New York Press.
I had one cover. I peaked. I had one cover of the New York Press, and then I never got another one. It looked good, but I think the paper kind of started falling apart right after. That was like 2004, 2005.
Yeah, no, that was one of my big areas. I was doing covers for alternative weeklies, and had this comic, and I was doing this Eye of the Beholder comic, and there were so many of them. And then they all disappeared. And
it was like this great network. We had like the Orlando Weekly. We had like the LA Weekly, the Baltimore Weekly. It was all these DC Weekly, and they were all owned by this little company.
Every town had a paper. And that was such great work because it was political.
Yeah.
Where I really started, getting my political yayas out and doing things for them. And they were wide open to, having really like strident political imagery that be harder to get other places. So it was really, that was one of the things 2008, just like everything fell off. That was all like, oops, that's all gone. And yeah, it's
because those were wonderful, because I love in New York City and every city like that, Baltimore, whatever, all these little towns had those boxes, right? That you could pick up a free weekly in those colored boxes.
That's because you had to know what restaurant to go to.
It was bright red, and it was on every corner in New York City. You could open up and get a New York Press, and I could open it up and I could open it. And my name would be right there in the byline. It would say artists, including, and it would say Marty, and I would say Marty Dundix. And I'd show people, and they were like, big deal, Marty. No one cares. And I'm like, I'm in the newspaper.
Didn't that Life in Hell guy, didn't he go do something else?
Something.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, while launching in those alternative papers. Yeah, no, that was good timing there. There's kismet, good timing. There's a lot of that standing at the door when it opens up. It's critical.
Peter, you've mentioned that you have stuff in your drawers. I don't think people would think that someone at your stature would have all this work that doesn't get published. People who are starting out, talking to people who are listening, who are thinking that someone like us, or everything we do gets published, but in fact, there's a lot of work that does not get out there and see the light of whatever. Yeah,
I mean, no, if you're doing really well, it means you've failed a huge amount rather than just a little. I mean, that's like one of the first things I say in class to students is that the number one thing you're going to have to get used to is failure. And I feel like, I pitched a cartoon this morning to the New Yorker. I pitched one the day before and the day before that. None of them went. That's par for the course. And don't think I don't feel every single time I pitch one, they're going to go for this one for sure. And I feel the same kind of like, it's now like a callous, but that's like part of the deal. And the thing that separates people who stay in the field and who don't are very, unless you have the crazy dumb luck where, people just jump on your work no matter what. You could be running from success and it'll chase you. I certainly did not have that experience. It was a lot of it was that knocking on the door. And, the fifth time I submitted the same cartoon, the New Yorker bought it, or I tweaked the caption. It's that kind of thing has happened again and again. And if
at least they don't say no, it's just a pleasant silence.
That's right. It's a pleasant silence, which is so, the warming silence of, like room tone.
They're like, shh, it'll be okay.
But you work really hard. That's like the one thing that people would want to know. It's like, how do you keep up that engine firing the way you do? I don't know anyone actually. I really don't know anyone who works as much as you do.
I really work. Because I'm always looking over at somebody and going like, how do they get that much done? I mean, how does Chip Kidd get every single cover and big book? Like every time I open a book, there's like, how do you do that? Plus all the other projects, plus doing books and things like that. So, it's really, really, I feel very lucky that my engine is primed by all the horrible things that are going on in the world to run faster. And I have had this general sense that goes back probably to when I saw the movie Failsafe, which was about, like the New York City gets blown up in a nuclear bomb by the Russians, and to avoid a third world war.
That sounds like your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I was right in my wheel. Well, that was when I first learned that there was this bomb that could blow things up, including where I really already wanted to move from Cleveland. Like, no, not yet. Please hold off. And so I really, that fixed this thing. This where the bomb has served me is that I had this feeling when I was in art school, like I just got it. If I could only get that book published before they dropped the bomb, if I could only do so-and-so before they dropped the bomb. Now, it can be like 20 other versions of that where it's like, well, if we could just get this done before the new variant of
COVID, now it's a virus,
or if I could just get this project finished up before climate change, has put my studio underwater, et cetera, et cetera. So
or can something else come along so I can stop looking at virus cartoons?
Well, I
need a new calamity.
You got the fires of out west, and there's I got a lot of burning fire ideas that keep developing.
There you go.
Peter, what would you like to accomplish next?
Well, this book that I'm working on, it's called Intersects, with where you see the word insect in the word intersect.
Right.
And lowercase, uppercase. That's going to take me maybe even a couple of years, but I've gotten to the point where I have a proposal that I'm pitching now. So I'm hoping I'm going to get interest in that, which then I can be doing that really consistently, because it's really important with a book project to have as much thinking about it all the time. Because if you really want to bring the pieces together, if you don't work on it all the time, if your brain is thinking about it, a project a lot, then you start dreaming about it and you wake up in the morning with an idea, and you can do that. If you're picking up the needle and putting it down, it's harder to figure out all the different angles. And this is a project that has so many different angles. I'm really concerned I'm going to miss something. But that said, I probably will still. I have a few things that I'm doing regularly. I'm syndicated through Kaggle, so I'm have to get cartoons to them regularly. I also do a weekly cartoon for Charlie Hebdo, and that was a thing that did drop in my lap. I pitched them one cartoon, like a 4-panel strip, and they said, well, and it was an environmental comic, and they would, how would you like to do an environmental column weekly? And it's a wordless strip too. So it's like picking up what I was doing with Eye of the Beholder and continuing that thread. And I'm just talking about current environmental disasters.
Wow.
That's a lot of work.
So, there's those little bugs on the moon that got up there somehow and they're still alive. I forgot their names. They're like
bugs on the moon. This is news to me.
Yes. No, this is, I'm pitching you stuff. So there's these little, they're not nematodes, but somehow they got up there and they're managing to survive because they're so minimalist in their needs. We'll fact check this and get this back to you, but
that's excellent.
So your final scene could be the world is obliterated and smoldering heat, and all of a sudden this little cockroach crawls out.
Well, that's certainly one of the options. I'm assuming that there's 10 quintillion insects in the world, and I suspect that there's some of them that are hardy enough to go on them and fungus.
You can always have that classic ending where they go like the beginning and with a question mark, like the Blob.
I got something like that. I have a slightly different ending, but I don't want to blow. I don't.
No, don't
give away the show.
Don't give it away.
But I do have a concept for endings. And speaking of ending,
we don't want to keep you forever, but we always ask all our guests: is it true that you once traded some jazz records with Robert Crumb in exchange to publish some of his cartoons?
Wait a minute, you asked this question of every guest that you have.
I just say no, but
usually it's a no. I would think it's that's a fairly windy story, but I grew up in Cleveland. Try to do the elevator pitch version of it. I grew up in Cleveland. I stumbled upon meeting this guy Harvey Pekar, who then went on to do a comic called American Splendor. He was working at a hospital at the time. He hadn't done American Splendor in 1971 when I met him. I was doing a fanzine. Because he had a comic on his table, his newspaper boy said, "Oh, there's a guy that has comics." And I literally went over and I rang his doorbell, and it was like, "Yes." And I said, "I understand you have comics." Open the door. It was at a time when you felt like it was your God-given right to meet anyone who had any kind of comics. And he literally let me up. He might have been like 30 at the time or late 20s. I was 12. And he not only showed me, he was like, "Oh yeah, well, I got this R. Crumb thing." And he showed me a drawing of a guy with his penis out peeing into a toilet. It was cover for High Tone Comics that I eventually got to buy that comic. And he had this incredible original drawing. And he had this huge 78 RPM collection. Fast forward about 6 months, and my parents were having a yard sale, and I stumbled upon in our basement 2 boxes of 78 RPM records that were left there by the owner of the house that my parents moved into, and I moved in there with them. And they said, "Okay, you can have those, whatever you can get for them, that can be yours in this yard sale. So I had him out. I was outside in the hot sun. I had one of the records out. It was starting to probably bend from the heat. And a guy came by. It was a record collector, clearly. And he took the record. He ran into our house. He said, "Where's a phone book?" He put a phone book on top of it to flatten it. And then he wanted to buy all of them. And my comic book geek collector spidey sense tingled. And I was like, I smell collector. Wait, there may be value here. And I said, "Excuse me for a moment." And I called Harvey and said, "There's this guy here who wants to buy all these 78 RPM records." I just remembered Harvey had them. And he's like, "Oh yeah, what's he look like?" I told him, and he's like, "Oh yeah, don't sell to him." And then he came over, he looked at it, and he was like, very matter of fact, he said, "Yeah, I think Crumb would like some of these." And he took 15 records, and I said, "Okay, I'll do a trade. You send them to Crumb in trade." He said, "Crumb would give you some artwork for this." And I said, "Okay, but I want an interview with Crumb," which was more my interest for my fanzine. So Seth and I typed up an interview, leaving spaces for Crumb to respond. Harvey sent 15 78 RPM records to Crumb and this interview. And then like 6 months went by, which was an eternity at that point. And I felt like rip off. And then I get a call from Harvey. "Hey, package showed up. And there's this incredible, beautiful piece of art from Unita Comics, one of Crumb's. It was like a classic original, and this interview that Crumb had written in pencil, his answers. And I rode home holding the original art and the interview on my bike. In one hand, I had the art. At one point, it flew out of my hand and landed.
Oh my!
I had to ride back and pick up the art. I still have this art. It's a treasure. The interview was just so hilarious because, again, I was 12. I turned 12 by that point. So we asked him, like, "Could you give us a rundown on the history of underground comics and left in this giant space?" And he just wrote, "No." And like, "What are your hobbies?" And I was like, "Fucking, taking drugs. What do you want to? What are your
have you ever met
your goals?" No, we had just like these dope questions, like, "What are your goals? What pen do you use? Do you think comics should have a meeting?" And he's like, if he's like, it should say, "Hi Ed, how's your mom?" It was just he just was clearly, got stoned and then wrote in these answers. And
it took him 6 months to do that.
It was all, this was a different time period. No, he was probably like 27 at the time, and he was already had been famous for quite a while. I'd done Keep on Trucking much earlier. And he ended up coming to town. He was traveling around. He was touring with the Cheap Suit Serenaders. He did a 78 RPM record himself with these guys. One of them was originally Terry Zwigoff, who ended up directing the film that Dan Klaus's film, Ghost World, and also did the Crumb documentary. Zwigoff wasn't with him, but these two other guys were with him. And they came over and dutifully sat and had tea with my parents. And I took them up to my room. I had nothing. It was just, it depressed me greatly. And I felt embarrassed about this for about 100 years. And just like, it was just the sadness of being around somebody who I revere so much. And his work was such a huge influence on me, but I was at a time when I had barely read his comics, and I felt like, he didn't do Spider-Man. Like, how,
it's amazing. I saw all the original work for the Genesis book in Columbus, Ohio. And you talk about an amazing amount of work where how the story ends. I mean, it's just like, okay, it's Genesis. And I go like, that's an investment of time and effort too. I mean, I can't imagine how you can keep that going, but
no, the Bible, I guess he kept it going. There was enough good visuals to keep him entertained. The closing on that story is, so Crumb wanted more of the 78s. And so we did another trade, and he said, "You do the cover to Seth and my fanzine of the time." And he was staying at Harvey Picar's. I went over there the next day after school to pick up the artwork, which he hadn't started yet. And so he was like, "Oh yeah, okay, I'll do it." But I don't know, my sense was he's going to try and get out of it or something. So I was like, "I'll wait." So I sat down on the couch And I basically was staring at the back of his head while he was working on this cover. And he sat down and dutifully drew out this unbelievably beautiful cover. And it took probably 3 hours that I sat there. But at a certain point of me, just literally sitting staring at him, he said, "Oh, well, here, why don't you look at this?" And he gave me a sketchbook. And I got to go through his sketchbook. And in that 3-hour period, I became a rather large fan. And he let me take the sketchbook overnight because I was like, well, can we publish some of this? I rode off on my bike with his sketchbook in one arm. This is a sketchbook that I think he traded for like his house in France later, is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I took it up to the local library and pumped dimes in there and photocopied pages and published them in a zine.
Wow.
And brought it back the next day. Fortunately, I dropped it in mud or anything.
Oh, you say oops, lost it. Sorry.
Yeah, we didn't learn anything from the bike story, Peter. We didn't learn anything from that. You couldn't get someone to drive you?
No, I could not at age 12. Like, hey, there's this guy who's drawn in a sketchbook that I want to go photocopy. Come pick me up.
But it was a cool banana bike too.
I like those.
As a matter of fact, it was, and it had butterfly handlebars.
Good for you. Peter, that does sound like a scene from the actual movie Ghost World when they're buying their old LP records. And it isn't it funny how there's such a coincidence with that? It comes kind of around.
Well, it's a small world. When you get in the comics world, there's a lot of this cross paths with thing that goes on. So. Well, and with that, we cross paths at the Voice, and that's decades ago. And here we are now.
Yeah, when you talk about your work, and my impression of you all these years is a little bit different. I always admired your confidence of going out and tackling things that were difficult, traveling and stuff. You say now that you weren't sure you wanted to do this. You came back, you were not sure about where you stood. I always saw you as someone who to aspire to, because you just went to these places. It was an adventure for you, and you came back with these pieces of artwork that were just amazing. And when you used to come back and show some of the work from your travels, it's always exciting.
Well, thank you. You're embarrassing me sufficiently, but it's a typical thing that you're always looking over at somebody else and thinking like, how do they do it? And although one of the great things about the world being in the precarious situation it is I'm finding myself doing that less because I'm not worrying about posterity as much as I once did. It's like, this is what we have right now. Be as upbeat, happy as possible, and look it in the eye too. And I'm going to draw about it as much as I can. I'm going to, at least pretend like I'm sure that I have years to get a book done, and that it kind of puts a lot of the worrying about that, if somebody else is doing better than I am to one side.
Well, if someone is doing better, there aren't a lot of them. So there you go.
That's a good place to end right there. Peter, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for doing this.
Yes, thank you, Peter.
It was really great to share your stories and stuff, and it's good to see you and see how well you're doing.
Thank you. Well, back at you guys. Good luck to all of us.
This was really great. I just want to thank you and say good night to our audience. Stay funny,
Bob.
stay cool, and stay in school. And see you next time.